Hello everyone. Today's topic is the crisis in the church. This is another instance of a time when popes and kings were not getting along, and there was a battle between the church and the state as to who would have influence and power inside kingdoms. Not surprisingly, kings think that kings ought to have all the power, and popes usually think the opposite. Our story this time starts with Philip IV, called Le Bel, the Fair or the Handsome, King of France from 1268 to 1314. He became king at 17 years old. He was a very strong personality. I don't know that if you look at this picture, which is of his grave effigy over here, that you will think of him as having been the handsome, but I do want to point out a truly inspiring 14th century hairdo there. Philip was involved with a noble family in Rome called the Orsini. And the Orsini had a sort of natural enemy in a family called the Colonna. The Orsini and the Colonna families were a little bit like the Montagues and the Capulets in Romeo and Juliet. They really did not get along. And in their international connections, they also didn't get along. The Orsini family was generally pro-French, and the Colonna family usually pro-German, pro-Holy Roman Emperor. In 1292, Pope Nicholas IV happened to die. The 10 cardinals of the time were evenly split between the Colonna and Orsini families, and so there was a 2-year impasse. Violence in the streets of Rome, arguments, but yet no one could get a majority of the cardinals in order to be elected pope. So the current 10 cardinals finally decided on a compromise candidate, an elderly hermit who lived outside of Rome, who nobody could object to because he had never been really outside of his monastery in his life. He took the name Celestine V. Celestine was very holy, deeply devoted, and unhappy to have been elected pope. He tried to turn it down and was not allowed to do so. And as pope, he was kind of a disaster. In consultation with the Orsini family, Celestine proceeded to create 12 brand new cardinals, almost all of whom were French or Neapolitan. So what happens here is that the Orsini family, backed by the King of France, now has a ruthless majority over the Colonna side of the cardinalate, which led to Celestine retiring after 5 months as pope. There was some question about whether or not it was possible to resign or to abdicate the papal throne, but Celestine ended up winning the day. He was the only pope to have abdicated until very recently, Benedict XVI. Here is the pope who was elected at the end of Celestine's tenure as pope. His name was Benedict Gaetani. He takes the papacy as Boniface VIII, and he's pope from 1294 to 1303 when he died. Boniface was a very powerful, very strong personality. In fact, he had helped Celestine V make the decision to step down from the papacy. He also wanted to step in when France and England went to war, and this is the very beginning of the war which will eventually become the 100 Years' War. Both the King of France and the King of England of the time were raising some of the money for their armies by taxing the churches inside their kingdoms. So they were actually taxing the church to get money to run the army. Boniface wanted to put a stop to that because he believed that the only money that should be gathered from the churches was to be gathered on behalf of the papacy. So he issued something called a bull, saying that the clergy could not be taxed without the Pope's permission. The bull is called clericos laicos. That's not something you need to worry about. A bull is a papal document expressing usually an opinion or a statement on some kind of doctrine. And they're sealed with a seal, but it's not a wax seal, it's a lead seal called a bullum, which is why these documents are called bulls. Here's a picture of one here with the lead seal on the bottom. You can see that it's been signed by the papal curia. So what ended up happening with clericos laicos was that Philip, the King of France, refused to stop taxing the church, and in fact put an embargo on the lower border of France in order to keep money from leaving France on its way to Rome. Now remember, there's no such thing as checking at this point. Money actually has to physically move from one place to another. So what Philip did was just simply to stop the ability of the local folks from allowing gold and silver to leave French territory. Okay. So Boniface issued a new bull, Unam Sanctam. We're going to read Unam Sanctam, which was done in 1302 for class. So this is the context in which that document takes place. Philip, however, ignored Unam Sanctam, and in 1303 Boniface excommunicated the King of France. This did not particularly bother Philip. He attacked Rome, and the Pope ended up dying. He was actually put into house arrest and ended up dying. So who wins a situation like this one? Well, you can see that there are several documents that demand that the church be exalted over the state in terms of power. But on the ground, because kings have armies and popes do not, the king tends to come out on top. What follows is a period when the church loses a great deal of its power and influence in Europe. And that is because of something called the Avignon papacy. So after the death of Boniface's successor, and we won't worry about all these different popes that sort of pop up in here, the pro-French cardinals engineered the election of a French candidate. He took the name Clement V, and he's pope from 1305 to 1314. Clement did Celestine V one better because he created 28 new cardinals, 25 of them French, so now getting us to approximately 50 cardinals. And then he did something even stranger. He pulled up stakes in Rome, took the entire papal court with him, and moved the papacy to the Holy Roman city of Avignon. Okay, so Rome, there's my cursor, here it is. So Rome is here. Okay. Avignon is here. This brown space right here is France. And eventually Provence will become part of France. And in Provence is the city of Avignon. Now Clement had a number of different reasons that he cited for making this move. But the main one seems to have been to be closer to French territory and also to be closer to the influence of the King of France. Not surprisingly, if you weren't French, you thought this was a very bad idea, and that the papacy had been hijacked by the French crown. These countries call this period the Avignon papacy, by the name Babylonian captivity. This is a reference to the Old Testament in which the Hebrew people were conquered and taken away as slaves by Babylon in the 5th century BC, so a very long time ago. But the implication is that evil invaders have stolen the papacy. And this lasts from 1305 to 1378 through several popes. So you can think a little bit about, and we'll talk about in class, how regular people are likely to see the moving of the papacy from Rome to Avignon, whether or not they would have liked it or not. In 1378, Pope Gregory XI moved the papacy back to Rome under a tremendous amount of political pressure by non-French politicians. But unfortunately, Pope Gregory XI's papacy didn't stick. The French cardinals didn't like him, and so they picked up stakes, they went back to Avignon, and elected a new pope. Now, it wasn't super unusual for there to be a pope and what they call an anti-pope. At this point, there were two popes reigning, one in Rome and one in Avignon, each of them excommunicating the followers of the other. So everybody in Europe is under a sentence of excommunication from either the Avignon Pope or the Roman one. You see the problem here. An attempt to fix this happened in 1409 when a third pope was appointed, but the first two popes refused to be deposed. So from 1409 to 1415, there were two popes, one in France and one in Avignon, and a third pope who was itinerant because he didn't have any place to be. This was all brought to an end by something called the Council of Constance in 1415, when all three popes were deposed, and upon their deposition, there was one pope from then on. Now look at how long this period is, 1305 to 1415. 110 years in which the papacy was so disorganized and so political that many people began to assume that the church was moving away from God. And this is the point at which, not surprisingly, kings begin to gain a lot of advantages over the church. What we're going to see from here on out is a move towards state power and a move away from religious power.